All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is how to dismantle stress forever. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be covering more specifically is first the overview itself, the illusion nobody talks about, the machinery behind mental paralysis, the wisdom of weight and will, the path that runs straight through, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one to master every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, make sure to book a call from the link in the description or the pinned comment, and we'll talk about it. With that said, let's actually get started and talk about the illusion that nobody talks about. So before we get into the mechanics and the philosophy and all the practical stuff, we need to talk about the one thing that tends to keep people stuck in stress cycles forever. And it's not the stress itself. It's the way you've been taught to think about stress. Because for most of us, the entire framing is off. And once you see how it's off, everything else in this training will make a lot more sense. So most people tend to treat stress like it's some external force that basically attacks them out of nowhere. Something that just happens to them when life gets hard. And that framing is probably the single biggest reason they never get free of it. The way stress gets talked about in self-help and popular psychology, you'd think it just rolls in without any warning and there's nothing you can do but brace for it. But what's actually happening for a lot of people is something much simpler and honestly, much more fixable. Stress, in most cases, is not the event itself. It's the mental spin you generate on top of the event. And that spin is where almost all of the real suffering actually lives. Now, the most effective way to break free of any destructive mental pattern is never about fighting the pattern with willpower. It's always about realizing that the thing you are fighting is largely an illusion. And once you truly see through that trick, there is nothing left to fight against. And stress, for a lot of us, tends to follow this exact same loop where something happens, you build a story around it, the story creates tension, and then you spend all this energy trying to manage the tension without ever going back to question the story that started the whole thing in the first place. The moment you stop treating that mental narrative as hard fact and start seeing it for what it actually is, which is just another thought that popped up and feels convincing, a lot of the emotional charge tends to fall away on its own without you ever having to do anything. And I'm not saying you should pretend that your problems are fake or act like nothing matters and nothing is really happening. It's about noticing that your reaction to the problem is usually doing significantly more damage than the problem itself. And that gap between what actually happened and what your mind made of it is really something that you can genuinely learn to work with. And the beautiful part is that once you see this mechanism clearly, you probably can't unsee it, which is the entire point of understanding it. Now, the stress response you feel, that tightness, that low-grade dread, and that sense of something is about to go wrong, most of the time it's not really pointing to any real danger in front of you. It's pointing at a future you most likely imagined, a scenario your mind constructed from fragments of past experience and general worry about what could possibly happen next. Now, your body doesn't actually know the difference between a real threat and an imagined one, which means you can sit in a perfectly safe room and flood yourself with the exact same chemicals you'd produce if something genuinely dangerous were happening right in front of you. Now, once you realize that, once you truly get that you are often manufacturing the very feeling you're trying to escape, it changes your entire relationship with the experience. It's not something happening to you anymore. It's something you're doing to yourself, and you can learn to stop. Now, there's something that gets missed almost every time people talk about stress. And I think it changes the whole conversation. There is a real and meaningful difference between chosen stress and imposed stress. And most people lump them together like they're the exact same experience when they're fundamentally not. So chosen stress is what shows up when you commit to something that actually matters, when you take on weight deliberately because the outcome is worth carrying it for. And that's a completely different animal from the stress that gets dropped on you without your permission. Now, think about someone training for a competition or building a business from nothing or raising a kid. That stress is real. Nobody's saying it isn't. But the fact that you chose it on purpose changes everything about how it feels. It's not suffering in the traditional sense. It's more like the soreness after a workout, the feeling that tells you that you're actually growing. And most people who feel this kind of stress would actually feel worse without it because it's connected to something they genuinely care about. Now, the problem starts when people forget they chose the hard thing and begin treating their own voluntary commitment like a prison sentence someone forced on them, which then tends to happen gradually and subtly over time. When the why behind the effort stays clear and present in your mind, the stress stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like fuel, like evidence that you're in motion and engaged with something real. Imposed stress is the other kind, and it's the stuff that genuinely lands on you from outside without any say on your part. A health scare, a layoff, someone you trusted letting you down, circumstances you couldn't have predicted and definitely didn't sign up for. Now, this kind of stress can feel heavier in some ways because there's no narrative of choice to hold on to. But even as a quick side strategy, before we move on, there's something you can do with imposed stress that changes the entire feeling of it almost instantly. You take extreme ownership of it. Whatever landed on your lap that you didn't ask for, you look at it and you say, this is mine now. I'm choosing to deal with this. I'm choosing to face it. I'm choosing to handle it on my terms. And what that does psychologically is move the experience from the imposed category into the chosen category. And yes, you didn't choose the event, but you can choose your response to it with full force and full commitment. And that change from passive recipient to active owner tends to dissolve a surprising amount of the heaviness that actually comes with feeling like life just happened to you. And it can be as simple as saying, I'm choosing this. I know it sounds simple and maybe even a bit funny, but if you open your mind and use it, it can put you in a completely different state. But even here, even with the legitimately imposed stress, the same principle still tends to apply. The event is the event. What makes it unbearable for most people is not the event itself, but the endless replaying and catastrophizing and mental looping that actually follows it. So learning to separate the actual situation from your mental commentary about the situation is probably the single most useful skill you'll ever develop when it comes to dealing with things you didn't choose and can't control. And the moment you make that separation, even just partially, you start to feel like you have some say in the matter again, which for most people is what they actually needed all along. Now, here's where it starts to get really interesting and maybe a little uncomfortable for some people. The stress you feel on a daily basis, that background tension that so many people describe as just being their normal state of existence, is in most cases being generated by a story you're telling yourself that you've repeated so many times it doesn't feel like a story anymore. And the story tends to have a very particular structure to it. Something bad is happening or about to happen. I'm not ready for it. I can't handle it. And if I don't figure this out, something terrible is going to follow. So the thing about this kind of internal storytelling is that it feeds on itself in a way that can be really hard to interrupt unless you know what you're looking for. You feel stressed, which makes you think something must be wrong, which generates more stress, which confirms the original feeling. And now you're spinning in a loop that has no exit because the proof and the problem are the same thing. Now, your brain is incredibly good at finding evidence for whatever it already believes. So once the stress narrative is running, everything you encounter starts to look like confirmation that you should indeed be stressed. So breaking the loop often just requires one honest moment of asking yourself whether the thing you're stressed about right now is actually happening right now, or whether you're reacting to a projection of something that might happen later. And for a lot of people, Stress has become the default setting, the background noise they're so used to that they don't even recognize it as optional anymore. And it's basically like living next to a highway. After a while, you stop hearing the traffic, but it's still affecting everything: your sleep, your mood, your ability to think clearly and be present. Just because something feels normal doesn't mean it's necessary. So the possibility that you could exist without that constant baseline tension is something most people have never actually considered. Not because it's unrealistic, but because they've never been shown that the tension is something they're generating themselves rather than something the world is inflicting on them. So let's talk about what's actually happening under the hood when you experience what people call stress, because understanding the mechanism itself is really what makes this whole approach work. So here's how the cycle tends to work for a lot of people. You create tension by overthinking a situation. You then try some coping mechanism or distraction to relieve the tension. The coping works temporarily, and then the overthinking returns because you never addressed the root of the problem. You only managed the symptom. The relief never lasts because you're treating what's on the surface while the thing underneath keeps producing more of the same feeling. Now, the root, in most cases, is not the external situation at all. It's your relationship to uncertainty and your habit of filling that uncertainty with worst-case narratives. And until you address that habit at its source, no other stress management technique will do anything more than temporarily take the edge off. Now, most stress advice operates entirely at the surface level, at the symptom level, giving you tools to cope with the feeling of stress without ever helping you understand why you keep producing the feeling of stress in the first place. So going deeper means looking at the assumptions you're carrying about what stress is and what it means about you and what it's trying to protect you from. Because in a lot of cases, it's not protecting you from anything real. And that can be a confronting thing to sit with, honestly, because it means taking some responsibility for an experience you've probably been blaming on your circumstances or your job or your relationships or just life in general. Now, the genuinely freeing part of all of this is how simple it tends to be once you see it. Not easy necessarily, but because seeing through a pattern you've been running for years takes some willingness to be uncomfortable for a moment, but it is simple. The stress was never the problem. Your interpretation of the stress was the problem. And interpretations can actually change. And that distinction from fighting the feeling to questioning the interpretation is what makes the difference between someone who manages stress and someone who actually gets free of it. For some people, this makes sense instantly, like a switch flipping. For others, it's more gradual, more of a slow dawning. Either way is fine. The point is that once the mechanism is seen, it loses most of its power. Now, everything we're going to cover from here on out, the philosophy, the psychology, the practical application, all of it sits on top of this one idea. Stress is not what it appears to be for most people. It's not an accurate reflection of how bad your life is or how many problems you have. It's a reflection of how your mind is processing uncertainty and discomfort, and that processing can be updated once you see how it works. That's the foundation. And with it in place, the rest of this starts to make a lot more sense. So think of this section as the lens adjustment that makes everything else in the training come into focus. Because without it, the ideas ahead might sound interesting, but they won't make sense the way they need to in order to actually change something for you. What comes next is going to go deeper into the specific triggers and patterns that tend to generate the most stress for people, and knowing that the mechanism is largely self-generated gives you a fundamentally different starting point for dealing with each one. And it also means you can actually approach the rest of this with a little more confidence, because you're not walking into a battle. You're walking into a conversation with yourself about how you've been thinking, and conversations can always go differently than they have before. The promise of this whole training, and I want to be upfront about this, is not that you'll never feel uncomfortable or tense again or stressed again. That would be honestly dishonest. The promise is that you'll understand what's actually happening when those feelings show up, and that understanding alone tends to take away most of the power those feelings have over you. This is about getting real with yourself about what stress is and what's just thinking you've never actually questioned. And if that sounds like something worth exploring, then obviously you're already in the right place to hear the rest of what's coming. So let's talk about the machinery behind mental paralysis. So now that we've established what stress actually tends to be for most people, let's look at the specific things that actually generate it. Now, contrary to what you might believe or think, it's not random. There are very predictable patterns that create the overwhelming majority of daily stress. Once you know what they are, they become a lot easier to catch in real time before they spiral into something that feels unmanageable. Now, the first one is indecision. This one is probably responsible for more unnecessary suffering than almost anything else on this list. And the reason is built right into the word itself. The Latin root, decidere, literally means to cut off. To decide is to kill every other option, to take the scissors to every alternative path and commit fully to the one you chose. And most people simply will not do that, because cutting off options feels like loss. And we are hardwired to avoid loss. We are loss averse, even when the thing we're losing is just an idea we were never going to act on anyway. So what happens instead is you sit in the middle, not choosing, not committing, keeping your options theoretically open, while burning enormous amounts of mental energy running simulations on which path might possibly turn out to be the best one. And that limbo state, that permanent maybe, is one of the most stressful places a human mind can live because it never resolves. There's no completion, there's no relief, there's just more weighing and more calculating and more worry about getting it wrong. And in that state, any decision will be the best one. So the irony is that by trying to avoid the pain of choosing wrong, you end up living in a state that's probably worse than any wrong choice could ever be. Because at least a wrong choice gives you feedback and movement and something concrete to work with. The real cost of indecision isn't that you might miss the best option. The real cost is that while you're deliberating, you're not doing anything at all. And time is passing. And the stress of inaction is compounding in the background. And any choice would be better than making no choice. And even better, you can build the identity of a person that could make any choice the best choice. Now, underneath most indecision, if you're honest about it, is some version of FOMO, or opportunity cost anxiety. The fear that whatever you choose, you'll miss out on the thing you didn't choose. And that missing out will be worse than where you end up. But what actually tends to happen in reality for most people who stay in that holding pattern is they don't end up with the best of both worlds. They think they do. They end up with neither. They get the stress of wanting both things, plus the reality of having committed to nothing. Or, let's say they do decide to chase both options. They somehow get both, which is very rare, but let's say they do. But now they have to maintain both, so they add even more stress to their lives. So keeping options open feels like freedom, but it's actually a kind of prison, because freedom without direction is really just spinning in circles, and spinning in circles is exhausting. The truth that most people resist is that a committed wrong choice, whatever wrong even means, almost always puts you in a better position than an uncommitted right one. Because commitment generates momentum, and momentum generates clarity, and clarity is what you actually need to make better choices going forward. And there's no such thing as 99% committed. You're either fully committed or you're not. So what you need to do here is simple, even if it's uncomfortable. Cut. Decide. Let the other options die. And watch how quickly the stress lifts once there's nothing left to deliberate about. Now, the second big stress generator, and this one runs a little deeper, is conflicting desires. This is different from indecision about external options. This is about wanting two things simultaneously that genuinely cannot coexist in the same life at the same time, And the tension between them creates a low-grade war inside you that you might not even be fully aware of. So you want freedom, but also security. You want to party all the time, but also achievement. You want to be liked, but also to speak honestly, which by definition means that sometimes you won't be liked. You want comfort, but also growth. These aren't just abstract philosophical tensions. These are real, lived contradictions that tend to show up in every important area of life, and they're responsible for a lot of the stress that people can't seem to trace back to any single cause. Now, the reason this kind of stress is so hard to identify is that it doesn't feel like stress about something specific. It feels generalized, like a background unease that's always there. What's actually happening is an internal tug of war, where part of you is pulling one direction and another part is pulling the opposite direction. And you're stuck in the middle, absorbing all the tension without ever resolving the pull. So the resolution here, and it's not always comfortable to get to, is radical honesty with yourself about which desire is the one you actually want, what need does it meet, which desire is actually yours, and which one you inherited or absorbed from other people's expectations, your culture, your upbringing, or some version of success that was handed to you before you were old enough to question it. So a surprising amount of what people think they want when they actually sit down and examine it turns out to be stuff they were told they should want by parents or peers or media or some unexamined cultural script that's been repeated since childhood. And the moment you get honest enough to say this desire isn't actually mine, I was just carrying it because I thought I was supposed to, a huge amount of the internal conflict just dissolves. And for the desires that are genuinely both yours, where you really do want both things and neither is actually inherited, well, the path forward is usually about integration rather than elimination. Finding a way to honor both in different contexts or at different times rather than trying to crush one in favor of the other. Sometimes this looks like seasons, periods where you lean more heavily into growth, followed by periods where you maybe prioritize rest, and accepting that rhythm instead of trying to be everything at once all the time. And sometimes it just means giving yourself permission to want contradictory things without treating that as evidence that something is wrong with you, because it's not. It's just what it feels like to be in a complex situation, a complex person with more than one dimension. However, you can't do everything all at once. Now, open loops are probably the most practical and immediately fixable source of stress on this entire list. And most people are drowning in them without realizing it. An open loop is anything you've committed to, thought about, or started that hasn't been completed, canceled, or consciously deferred with a clear plan for when you'll deal with it. So every unanswered email that you intended to answer, every half-finished project, every vague promise you made, every idea you had that you wrote down somewhere and then you forgot about. Each one of those is running in the background of your mind like a browser tab you can't see, but that's still draining your battery. Now, the thing about open loops is that individually, any single one of them is trivial. It's not that big, right? It's no big deal, but they do accumulate. And after a while, you've got 30 or 40 or 60 of these tiny unresolved commitments pulling at your attention, and the cumulative weight of them creates this feeling of being overwhelmed that seems completely out of proportion to what's actually on your plate. So your brain, it turns out, is remarkably bad at letting go of unfinished things. There's a well-known psychological phenomenon around this where incomplete tasks stay active in your mental workspace and keep demanding processing power even when you're focused on something else entirely. It's called the Zeigarnik effect, named after the psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, who first studied it in the 1920s. She noticed that waiters in a restaurant could remember complex unpaid orders in perfect detail, but the moment that the bill was settled, the entire order vanished from their memory almost instantly. The brain treats unfinished business as priority that it refuses to close. And it will keep looping back to it and nudging you with low-level anxiety until the task is either completed or consciously resolved in some way. And this is actually a feature of our brain designed to keep important things from slipping through the cracks. But in a modern life, where you might have dozens or hundreds of these threads open simultaneously, that feature starts working against us because your brain can't distinguish between a genuinely urgent, incomplete task and a half commitment that you made 3 weeks ago that doesn't actually matter anymore. And so people walk around feeling exhausted and stressed and stretched thin, and when someone asks them what's wrong, they say they don't really know. It's just everything. But it's not everything. It's 50 tiny somethings that were never properly closed. So the fix is almost absurdly simple, even though very few people actually do it consistently. You go through every open loop and you do one of 3 things with it. First, you list them out. That's step 0. Then you complete it right now if it takes less than a few minutes. Or you schedule a specific time to deal with it if it's bigger than that. Or you consciously drop it entirely and accept that it's not going to happen, and that's fine. That third option of dropping it is the one most people struggle with because it feels like failure or irresponsibility, or it feels like they're missing out on something. Again, back to the FOMO. But carrying a commitment you're never going to actually fulfill is way more irresponsible than letting it go, because at least when you let it go, key point, you've made a choice and decided, back to the previous one, you free up the mental space for things you actually will follow through on. So you need to be able to decide. Once again, you need to cut off options and be okay with the quote-unquote opportunity cost and the quote-unquote fear of missing out. Now, the relief that comes from even a single session of closing open loops is sometimes so immediate and so big that people are genuinely shocked by how much lighter they feel afterwards. So making this a regular practice or a weekly sweep of open loops is probably one of the most tangible things you can do to reduce your baseline stress level, and it requires zero philosophy or mindset work at all. Just basic mental housekeeping every Sunday. And building on that and on what we just covered with open loops, there's a really practical framework that tends to cut through a lot of the noise when it comes to stress that follows you home from work or creeps in during your downtime. When you strip it all down, there are really only 3 types of things that cause stress to show up in your mind outside of your working hours. Each one has a straightforward path to resolution that takes the weight off almost immediately. Now, the first is something you forgot to do. So it's some task or commitment that slipped through the cracks, and now it's sitting in the back of your mind, pulling at your attention during hours when you should be resting or present with the people around you. Now, the fix here is almost too simple to feel real. Write it down. That's it. Get it out of your head and onto paper or a screen, and resolve to handle it first thing when you're back at your desk or when you can. That's it. The stress isn't about the task itself, by the way. It's about the fear of forgetting it again, which is an open loop again, back to the open loops we discussed. And the moment you capture it somewhere reliable, that fear dissolves. So your brain is not really a storage device. It's a processing tool. And the moment you stop trying to use it to hold on to every outstanding item and start offloading those to an external system, the mental load drops in an almost disproportionate way to how simple the action was. Now, the key piece here is the resolve, right? It's not enough to just write it down. You actually need to attach a clear intention to deal with it at a specific time, because as we discussed, half commitments create almost as much background stress as forgotten tasks do. Now, the second is something you realized you messed up. This is the second source of stress. Maybe it was an email you sent too quickly. Maybe it was a deadline you missed, a conversation where you said the wrong thing. Whatever it is, the stress here comes from the gap between what happened and what you wish had happened. And it tends to loop endlessly if you don't give it a clear resolution path. So you ask yourself one honest question. Is it fixable or not? If yes, you write it down and make a note to fix it as soon as you're able to. If not, you may need to make amends, but then you need to let it go. Meaning genuinely let it go. Carrying it around doesn't undo it and doesn't help anyone, least of all you. So most mistakes honestly are more fixable than they feel in the moment. The stress inflates the severity, and once you actually sit down to address it, you often find it's a 10-minute correction that your mind turned into a 3-day ordeal. And for the ones that genuinely can't be undone, the practice of just making amends and then releasing it is one of the most freeing things you can do. Not because it erases the mistake, but because holding on to it after you've done what you can is really just self-punishment. So every mistake you face directly and resolve cleanly becomes a data point that builds your confidence for the next one. And over time, that pattern of facing rather than avoiding will compound into a fundamentally different relationship with imperfection. A lot of the times also our mind loops on our mistakes or the things that we didn't do correctly because it's trying to extract a lesson from those situations. And until you sit down and actually write down what the lesson was, what is the feedback you got from the whole situation? What is that lesson? What is that one thing or insight that you're going to take from it so that this doesn't repeat again? Until you sit down and do that, your mind is going to keep looping the same mistake on purpose. It's trying to make you not forget it because it doesn't want it to happen again. So it keeps it at the front of your mind at all times. And the only way for you to stop that is by actually sitting down, thinking about the mistake you made, and extracting a lesson from it. And then from then on, every time that mistake comes up in your mind, you can just basically tell yourself that, hey, we've extracted the lesson here. We've extracted the insight. I can let this go now. It will not repeat anymore. I found my lesson. And then your mind will calm down because now you have extracted the insight from the whole situation. Now, the third source of stress here, and this might seem crazy to think that it can cause stress, but the third one is a new idea. Something that pops into your head unexpectedly, an insight, a creative spark, a connection you suddenly see between two things that maybe felt unrelated before. These feel different from the other two because they're exciting rather than anxiety producing, even though anxiety and excitement kind of feel the same. But they can also create stress in their own way because your mind doesn't want to lose the ideas. It keeps circling back, rehearsing the idea, trying to hold on to it. So what you need to do is the same as the first two. Just write it down and commit to acting on it once you're back in a position to do something with it. Now, ideas are fragile and they're also valuable, and your mind knows that, which is why it won't stop reminding you until you've gotten the thought down somewhere external. The faster you capture it, the faster your mind lets go of the need to keep rehearsing it. And over time, this will build a kind of trust between you and your own system. Your brain learns that when something important comes up, it will be captured and dealt with. And that trust will reduce the baseline need to keep everything running in your mental background. Now, there's also a concept from Buddhist teaching that maps onto everything we've been talking about, and it's one of the most useful frameworks for understanding stress or suffering that I've come across, and it's called the second arrow. Now, the idea is that when something painful happens, that's the first arrow, and you can't always avoid first arrows. They're just obviously part of being alive. But then almost immediately after the first arrow lands, you fire a second one at yourself. And that second arrow is your reaction to the pain, your narrative about the pain, your judgment of yourself for being in pain, and your anxiety about what the pain means for the future. And that second arrow, in most cases, does far more damage than the first one ever did. The first arrow might be a rejected proposal, a difficult conversation, or an unexpected bill. The second arrow is the 3 sleepless nights catastrophizing about what it means, replaying the situation over and over, imagining worst-case scenarios that haven't happened and probably never will. Now, the disproportion between the actual event and the mental response to the event is sometimes staggering once you start paying attention to it. A 10-minute problem can generate 3 days of suffering if you let the second arrow do its thing. And for many people, firing that second arrow isn't a choice they make consciously, it's a deeply ingrained habit. Something that happens automatically the moment discomfort shows up, and it takes real awareness to actually catch it before it launches. So the idea here is really straightforward, even though it takes some patience to develop. When something stressful happens, you try to notice the gap between the event and your response. And that gap can be very, very small, maybe just a fraction of a second, but it's there. And in that gap is where you have a choice. You can let the narrative spin up and carry you away, or you can feel the first arrow, acknowledge that it's unpleasant, and then deliberately choose not to launch a second and third and fourth. Now that gap will get wider with practice, almost like a muscle that strengthens over time. And as it widens, you'll start to experience events more clearly, more as they actually are rather than through the filter of all the story you usually add on top. And what most people discover when they get even a little bit good at this is that the vast majority of stressful events, stripped of the second arrow, are actually pretty manageable, right? It was the story that made them feel impossible. And this connects to maybe the most practical insight in this entire section, which is the fundamental asymmetry between thinking about doing something and actually doing it. The amount of mental energy and stress that goes into worrying about a task, dreading a conversation, putting off an email, avoiding a decision, it's almost always, in real practical terms, significantly greater than the energy it would take to just do the thing, right? You spend 3 weeks stressed about a phone call that takes 11 minutes, maybe. You spend 6 months dreading a project that takes 2 focused afternoons. You lie awake at night over an email that takes 4 sentences to write. The weight of the anticipation is orders of magnitude heavier than the weight of the action itself. And once you start noticing this pattern, you see it absolutely everywhere in your life and in the lives of the people around you. And this reveals something important about the nature of stress for most people. It's not really about how hard your life is or how much you have to do. It's always about how much you're thinking about what you have to do versus how much you're actually doing. So the stress to action ratio is almost always wildly skewed towards the stress side, which means the solution in most cases is not to reduce what's going on your plate, but to reduce the gap between deciding to do something and actually doing it. And what tends to happen once you just start is that the stress drops almost immediately because you're now engaged with reality instead of wrestling with your imagination about reality. You're dealing with what's actually in front of you instead of the 67 versions of what is going on in your mind that your mind basically generated while you were putting it off. So action is genuinely one of the most underrated stress reducers there is, and it doesn't require any mindset shift or philosophical understanding. Quite the opposite. You just dumb yourself down and do the thing. And the relief is so immediate and so tangible that it almost feels like cheating. And it compounds too, because every action you take closes an open loop, which reduces background stress, which gives you more mental energy, which makes the next action easier to take, and so on and so forth in a positive spiral. That's the exact opposite of the negative spiral most people are stuck in. So, with that said, let's actually cover the wisdom of wait and will. So, we've looked at the practical machinery of stress, the patterns that generate it on a daily basis as well. But there's a deeper layer underneath all of this that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. And understanding it doesn't just help you manage stress better. It changes your fundamental relationship to discomfort or effort and the experience of being alive in a world that will never be fully within your control. And this section might feel a bit more abstract at first, but stick with it because it circles back to something deeply practical. So, Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher who spent most of the 1800s being relentlessly honest about the nature of human experience, had this idea he called the will. And it wasn't willpower or determination, the way we usually think of those words. It was something more fundamental than that. The will, for Schopenhauer, was this blind, restless, never satisfied driving force underneath everything you do and everything you feel. This constant wanting and striving and reaching for the next thing that never stops no matter how much you achieve or acquire. So you get the job you wanted and immediately start worrying about the next promotion. You buy the house and start thinking about the renovation. You finish the project and you feel empty until you start the next one. That's the will. It's working exactly as designed, which is to keep you moving, keep you wanting, keep you in a state of perpetual dissatisfaction that propels you forward whether you like it or not. In other words, you can also call it hedonic adaptation. And this is an incredibly important thing to understand when it comes to stress, because it means that a certain amount of restlessness and dissatisfaction isn't something wrong with you. It's the baseline condition of being a conscious creature with desires. There's something genuinely relieving about hearing that too, for a lot of people, because they've been operating under the assumption that if they just got their life sorted out enough, the tension would finally stop. But that's not the case. You'll still want more. And Schopenhauer is basically saying, no, it won't, and that's okay. The tension is the engine. The question is whether you're going to be dragged around by it unconsciously or learn to work with it on your own terms. So Schopenhauer's suggestion, broadly speaking, was that awareness of the will was the first step towards freedom from its worst effects. You can't stop the wanting entirely, but you can stop mistaking every new want for an emergency. You can notice the pull without automatically following it, and that noticing is what creates space between you and the restless feeling that otherwise runs your entire life. So that space is really where peace actually lives, not in the absence of desire, but in the awareness of it. Subtle but important distinction. And developing this awareness is honestly a lifelong practice, but even a small increase in your ability to notice the will doing its thing without automatically reacting to it tends to reduce your stress level noticeably. It also tends to generate a lot of compassion for yourself and other people, because once you see that everyone is dealing with the same restless force, the pressure to have it all figured out starts to loosen considerably. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche, on the other hand, who came after Schopenhauer and was deeply influenced by him, looked at the same situation and came to a fundamentally different conclusion. Where Schopenhauer said the will is suffering and the best you can do is learn to detach from it, Nietzsche said something much bolder. He said the point isn't to escape the weight, the point is to become the kind of person who can actually carry it. Self-overcoming, that was his thing. Not running from difficulty, not transcending it through detachment, but growing larger than it through the act of facing it directly and deliberately. And this is where the concept of amor fati comes in, the love of fate, the practice of not just accepting what happens to you, but actually embracing it as necessary, as the exact material you needed in order to become who you're capable of becoming. And as Nietzsche put it in Twilight of the Idols, what does not kill me makes me stronger. And when you apply that to stress, the entire dynamic changes, right? Stress will no longer be something you're trying to get rid of. You will start treating it as raw material, the resistance that makes the muscle grow. Because without it, there's nothing to push against and therefore no growth. So think about the people you most admire, the ones who seem genuinely grounded and capable and unshakable. None of them got that way by having an easy life. They got that way by facing hard things repeatedly and not breaking. And every round of difficulty added another layer of resilience that you can see in how they carry themselves. And Nietzsche wasn't saying you should seek out suffering for its own sake or that there's something noble about being miserable. He's saying that when stress and difficulty and challenge inevitably arrive, and they always do, the choice is between shrinking from it or using it as fuel for becoming more. And that choice, made repeatedly over time, is what separates people who grow from people who just survive. And this is an important distinction from passive acceptance. Nietzsche wasn't a passive thinker. He didn't believe in lying down and taking it. Overcoming means actively engaging with the thing that's challenging you, going towards it with full force, using your will not to escape the difficulty, but to transform it and transform yourself in the process. So while Schopenhauer gives you the awareness and space, Nietzsche gives you direction and fire. And both are useful. Awareness, so you're not blindly reactive. Fire, so you're not passively dormant. Now, the person who integrates both, who can see the will for what it is and also choose to engage with life's challenges as opportunities for growth is probably the strongest possible position when it comes to dealing with stress or anything else for that matter. Now, Billie Jean King said it succinctly: pressure is a privilege. Most people hear that and think it's just a nicer way to say toughen up, but the real depth of it goes further than that. Here's the thing: you only feel pressure when the stakes are genuinely real, right? And the stakes are only real when you've earned or created a position where your performance actually matters. If nothing is on the line, there is no pressure. It's not possible. Pressure requires that something meaningful depends on what you do next, which means the very presence of pressure is proof that you're in the arena, that you're doing something that matters. So when you feel that weight before a big presentation, or that tightness in your chest before a difficult conversation, or that knot in your stomach before launching something new, that feeling isn't evidence that you're in danger. It's evidence that you're in a position where things matter, and that's not something most people should take for granted. The shift from seeing pressure as a threat to seeing pressure as proof of your position is one of the fastest ways to change your emotional state in a high-stakes moment, and it doesn't really require lying to yourself or pretending the pressure isn't there. It just requires seeing it accurately for what it is. And there's even something close to gratitude that can emerge from this perspective. Because the alternative to pressure, what is it? It's irrelevance, or even boredom from not doing anything meaningful. And very few people who've tasted both pressure and irrelevance would voluntarily go back to the latter. So the key distinction that makes this useful is that it separates the feeling of pressure from the story about what the feeling means. The feeling is just activation, your nervous system getting ready for something that matters. The story is usually something along the lines of: you're going to fail, everyone will see you mess up, you're not ready, you're in over your head. And once again, it's the story that creates the suffering, not the feeling itself. Elite performers across every field, athletes, musicians, surgeons, entrepreneurs, tend to have a different relationship with pressure than everyone else, and it's not that they feel less of it. They often feel more. The difference is that they've learned to interpret the feeling as readiness. And the good news is that this interpretation is learnable. It can be yours. At the end of the day, it comes down to perception, and perception can be changed. It's a perspective you practice, and the starting point is just recognizing that pressure only shows up when you've put yourself in a position that is worth being in. So pulling all three of these together, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and the pressure is a privilege idea, gives you a philosophical framework for stress. Schopenhauer shows you that restlessness and wanting are the default human condition, and that seeing them clearly is the beginning of freedom. Nietzsche shows you that the difficulty you face isn't just to be endured, but to be used as material for becoming more. And the privilege frame shows you that the weight you feel is often evidence of a life worth living rather than evidence that something has gone wrong. Now, these three perspectives build on each other: awareness first, then engagement, then gratitude for the opportunity to engage. And when you hold all three of them together, stress starts to feel like a companion that shows up whenever you're doing something that actually matters. These are ideas from some of the deepest thinkers in human history who wrestled seriously with the question of suffering and came out the other side with something genuinely useful. So take this into your next stressful moment and ask yourself what each one of these perspectives would say about what you're experiencing right now. And if nothing else, just knowing that thinkers far smarter than any of us struggled with the exact same internal experiences and found real ways through them is really grounding. You're not the first person to feel this, and the fact that it's been examined this thoroughly for this long should tell you something about both how universal it is, but also how workable it tends to be once you engage with it. So with all of that in the background, let's turn to the most practical section of this whole training, the actual path through stress and out the other side. So let's talk about the path that runs straight through. So we've dismantled the illusion, we've mapped the machinery, and we've pulled in some of the deepest philosophical thinking on suffering and striving. Now it's time to talk about what you actually do when stress shows up. And the answer might surprise you, because it goes against basically everything you might know. You don't manage it, you don't cope with it, you don't breathe through it and hope it passes, you walk straight into it. There's a principle that shows up across traditions and disciplines from psychotherapy to martial arts to spiritual practice, and it goes like this. What you resist persists. The more energy you put into fighting a feeling, the more that feeling anchors itself into your experience and refuses to leave. It's counterintuitive because everything in our conditioning tells us that the way to deal with something unpleasant is to push it away, distract from it, overpower it somehow. But feelings don't work like that, especially stress. So the moment you declare war on it, you give it a permanent place in your attention. It lives in your head rent-free, in other words. So there's a real paradox here that tends to trip people up at first. Fighting stress is one of the most stress-producing activities there is. You're tense about being tense, anxious about your anxiety, stressed about how stressed you are, and each layer of resistance adds another layer until you can't even remember what the original stressor was, because now the dominant experience is just resistance all the way down. So the amount of energy people burn fighting their own internal states is genuinely staggering. Energy that could be going into creative work, relationships, building something meaningful, problem solving. Instead, it's all being funneled into an internal battle that by design can never be won through force. And this is why so many people feel exhausted without having done anything particularly demanding with their day. They haven't been productive tired. They've been resistance tired, which is a completely different kind of fatigue and one that rest alone doesn't tend to fix. Now, the alternative, and it sounds almost too simple to be real, is to stop resisting. Which doesn't mean to passively lie down and accept a bad situation. That's not what this is about. It's to stop fighting the feeling of stress and instead redirect the energy towards engaging directly with whatever the feeling is pointing at. So you feel stressed about a conversation you need to have. Stop managing the anxiety and go have the conversation. You feel stressed about a financial situation. Stop distracting yourself and actually look at the numbers. You feel stressed about a decision. Stop waiting around and actually commit to something, whatever it is. Make a choice, make a decision. The way through stress is almost always through the thing causing the stress, not around it, not over it, not under it, directly through it. And the moment you move toward it instead of away from it, the stress begins to lose its foundation because the stress is almost always coming from the avoidance of the situation, not the situation itself. You've had the capacity all along. The only thing that was missing was the willingness to face it head on rather than sideways. And this brings us to a more active version of the same idea. Don't just stop resisting, but actually lean in. Force yourself on the thing that's causing you stress with full deliberate engagement. It will stop feeling as powerful once you're moving through it. Most stressful situations lose a significant portion of their intensity the moment you engage with them directly and with full focus. The stress lives in the gap between awareness and action. It lives in the maybe I will and the I should probably and the I'll deal with this later space. Close that gap and the stress has nowhere to exist. So the relief is often immediate. You know the feeling. You finally do something you've been putting off, and the first thought is always the same. Why didn't I just do this sooner? And the answer is that your mind made it seem bigger than it actually was, and you believed the projection instead of engaging with reality. And every time you lean in and discover that the thing was more manageable than your mind suggested and weaker than your own will, you build a new pattern. The gap between awareness and action becomes a little smaller, and eventually, for many people, it becomes almost reflexive to move toward discomfort and get the priceless feeling of winning than to ignore it. Now, I'm not saying you should pretend to feel fearless or pretend you don't feel nervous or uncomfortable. The feeling is fine and normal. The idea is to not let the feeling dictate your own behavior. You feel the stress and you move anyway. You feel the discomfort and you engage anyway. It will eventually become the strongest version of yourself, acting in spite of the feeling rather than waiting for the feeling to pass. And at some point, you'll actually learn to love that feeling. Real courage, the kind that actually changes your life, isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more than the fear. Courage can't be the absence of fear. Courage literally means to overcome fear. So if there is no fear, there is no courage. And what you do repeatedly becomes who you are, and the person who consistently moves towards difficulty rather than away from it develops a relationship with stress that most people can't even imagine. Now, speaking of identity, this is one of the sneakiest things about chronic stress that almost nobody talks about. Some people, and this might be uncomfortable to hear, are genuinely attached to being stressed. It's become part of how they see themselves. Stress is their proof of importance, their evidence of a big life, their badge of busyness that signals to the world and to themselves that they matter and that their time is valuable and that they are serious people doing serious things. They've attached stress to their sense of worth as people. So think about how often people lead with how stressed they are in casual conversations. How are you, you ask? And they respond with, oh my God, so busy, so stressed, it's been insane. And there's almost a competitive element to it in certain circles where the more overwhelmed you are, the more important you seem. And all of that, consciously or not, creates an incentive to stay stressed because the stress is performing a social/psychological function that has nothing to do with the actual demands of your life. Stress, as a status signal, is so deeply embedded in certain professional and other cultures that people feel genuinely uncomfortable when they're not stressed, as if something must be wrong, as if they're not doing enough, as if calm equals lazy or irrelevant. This is the exact same dynamic that plays out with any deeply ingrained habit. Part of a person's identity gets wrapped up in the pattern itself, the routines, the familiar discomfort, the way it shapes your day and your social interactions. Letting go of the habit literally means letting go of a piece of who you thought you were, and that's scary even when the thing you're letting go of is clearly hurting you. So what you need to do is really to just ask yourself whether your stress is actually about your circumstances or whether it's performing a function in your identity. Are you stressed because your life demands it, or are you stressed because on some level you've decided that stress is what you are supposed to feel? And if it's the second one, which for many people it tends to be at least partially, then no amount of life optimization will fix it because you'll just find new things to be stressed about to maintain the identity. And this is probably the most confronting idea in this whole training because it asks you to take responsibility for something you've probably been blaming on external factors your entire adult life. But it's also maybe the most liberating because the moment you untangle your identity from your stress level, you give yourself permission to exist without the constant fake busyness. So, ask yourself, if tomorrow morning all of your stress disappeared completely, would you know who you are without it? And now, the heart of everything we've been building throughout this training. Most real stress, meaning the stress that comes from actual events and actual circumstances that you need to deal with, is surprisingly manageable for most people. It just is. You get the news, you feel it, you deal with it, you move forward. That process, painful as it might be in the moment, painful as it might be sometimes, tends to resolve itself with reasonable speed once you actually engage with reality. What isn't manageable, what makes people feel genuinely stuck and overwhelmed and like they can't breathe, is the thinking about the stress. The layer upon layer of story and narrative and projection and catastrophizing and self-judgment that gets piled on top of what was originally a fairly straightforward problem. So if you really think about it, it's a distraction. Stress is a distraction. The overthinking isn't working on the problem at all. It's a way to avoid the problem while feeling like you're doing something. Your mind stays busy so it feels like you're doing something, but nothing actually changes in the real world. Instead of facing the discomfort, you stay in analysis because it temporarily reduces the fear of action, even though it increases long-term stress. So thinking about all the possible scenarios gives you the sensation of control. If I think enough, I'll prevent the bad outcome. It drains your attention and your confidence, and it delays the only thing that reliably lowers stress: direct engagement with the thing in front of you, engagement with the real world, with reality as it is. Like we talked about earlier with the second arrow, the stress itself is the first arrow, right? Your thinking about the stress is the second, third, fourth, and 47th arrow. And by the time you finish thinking about it, the original stressor has been magnified to a degree that bears almost no resemblance to the actual situation you're facing. You started with a problem and ended with a crisis, and the only thing that changed between those two was the amount of mental activity you layered on top. So you need to learn to recognize when you've moved from dealing with an actual problem to dealing with your own thinking about the problem. Not because thinking is bad, thinking is obviously necessary, but controlled repetitive thinking that generates emotion without generating solutions is not useful to anyone. A good rule of thumb is, if you've been thinking about the same thing for more than a few minutes without arriving at a new insight or a concrete next step, you're not problem solving anymore. You're just looping, and the loop itself is the stress. So the stress is almost never the thing, it's always the resistance to the thing. That's why I said stress is a distraction. The thinking about the thing, the avoidance of the thing, the identity wrapped around the thing, strip all of that away, and what you're left with is usually just a thing. A situation, a task, a conversation, a number, something concrete and finite that you can engage with directly and deal with and then move on from. The most effective way to break any cycle isn't necessarily to find better coping strategies for the discomfort. It's to understand that the discomfort was manufactured by a pattern you thought was protecting you, and once you see that, it's over. Most of what you're feeling isn't the weight of your life, it's the weight of your thinking about your life. And that's an invitation to experiment with the possibility that you've been making this harder than it needs to be for yourself. Most people have, and the moment you stop making it hard, well, it tends to stop being hard. So the illusion is that stress is an accurate report on the difficulty of your circumstances. The reality is that stress is mostly a byproduct of how your mind is processing those circumstances. Indecision, conflicting desires, open loops, resistance, identity attachment, overthinking, and looping. These are the actual generators, and every single one of them is something you have influence over once you actually see them. So the path forward is simple, even though it's not always easy. Decide, commit, close your loops, stop resisting the feeling and start engaging with what's behind it, and question whether your stress is serving a function in your actual identity. And above all, learn to catch the moment when you've moved from dealing with a real situation to running in circles in your own mental stories about it. Now, keep in mind, this is a practice. Some days you'll catch it instantly and the stress will dissolve immediately. Other days it will take you an hour or a week to realize you've been looping. Both are fine, the direction matters more than the speed. The direction is always the same, towards the thing, not away from it. Through the discomfort, not around it. Into the reality of the situation, rather than into the fantasy about what the situation might become. Engage with reality. Stress for most people and in most situations feels essential. It feels like it's keeping you safe, keeping you alert, keeping you responsible, but when you actually examine it honestly, most of it is just mental noise that's costing you far more than it's actually giving you. And seeing that is the way through. Not fighting, not managing or coping or distracting, just seeing without the layers. That's all it tends to take for a lot of this to just change. And if you're still skeptical, that's perfectly fine. Skepticism is healthy, and honestly, I welcome it. If you weren't skeptical, I would find it weird. All I'd suggest is that you try it once. Pick the thing you've been most stressed about this week, engage with it directly, and notice what happens to the feeling the moment you move towards it. That experience will tell you everything you need to know. So with that said, let's cover the review. We talked about the overview, the illusion nobody talks about, the machinery behind mental paralysis, the wisdom of weight and will, the path that runs straight through, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. First, pick the one thing you've been putting off, the decision, the conversation, the task that's been sitting in the back of your mind, generating low-grade tension for days or weeks, and commit to doing it within the next 24 hours without negotiating yourself about the timing. Then sit down and list every open loop you're currently carrying, every unanswered message, unfinished task, half-made plan, and vague commitment, and close each one by completing it scheduling it, or dropping it entirely. And the next time you feel stressed, pause long enough to ask yourself whether you're reacting to an actual situation or to a story you built on top of the situation, and see what happens when you engage with the situation directly with actual reality instead of wrestling with the story. With that said, if you want to work with me one-on-one, as I said in the beginning, on improving every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, make sure to book a call from the link in the description or the pinned comment. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was helpful. And thank you for the support. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.